What if Adrian Newey didn't join Aston Martin to design a fast car? What if he joined to permanently change what this team is capable of becoming? Inside Formula One, there's a growing sense that Newey's move wasn't about 2026 lap time at all. It was about rewriting Aston Martin's DNA in a way most teams only attempt once and usually fail. There are quiet indications that the real impact of Newey's arrival won't be obvious on launch day, or even in the first races. It's hidden in decisions already made, concepts already locked in, and a direction that can't be reversed without consequences. And here's the part almost no one explains clearly. Once you understand why Newey chose this moment, this team, and these rules, you start to realize why following this story closely might matter more than it first appears. From the outside, Adrian Newey's arrival at Aston Martin looked like a headline move. A veteran designer joining an ambitious project, late in his career, with nothing left to prove. But inside Formula One, that interpretation never really held. Because Newey doesn't move for comfort, money, or nostalgia. He moves when the conditions are right to impose order on chaos. And 2026 represents the largest controlled chaos the sport has offered in more than a decade. What people often miss is that Newey didn't arrive to improve Aston Martin. He arrived to remove uncertainty. Before his presence, Aston Martin had talent, resources, and ambition, but no single axis everything revolved around. Decisions were negotiated. Compromises were normal. Different departments optimized for different futures. Newey's influence collapses all of that into one timeline, one philosophy, one direction. That shift alone can change a team's trajectory before a single lap is driven. Inside Silverstone, sources describe a subtle but profound change after Newey settled in. Design conversations stopped orbiting around what might work. They started orbiting around what must work. When Newey commits to an interpretation of the rules, debate doesn't disappear, but it sharpens. Ideas are no longer judged on safety or precedent. They're judged on coherence. On whether they survive the full regulation cycle, not just the opening races. That kind of thinking is rare, and it's uncomfortable for teams not used to it. This is where 2026 becomes central to understanding Newey's decision. The new regulations don't just reset aerodynamics. They reset the hierarchy of performance. Energy deployment, power unit integration, active aerodynamics, weight distribution, all of it must be reconsidered at once. Most teams see that as a risk. Newey sees it as leverage. Because when everything changes simultaneously, experience doesn't just help. It dominates. Newey's history under clean sheet regulations isn't mythology. It's pattern. Each time, his first car in a new era didn't just win races. It defined how rivals understood the rules. That's the deeper fear around Aston Martin now. Not that they'll be quick, but that they'll force others to redesign their thinking mid-cycle, when it's already too late. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous is that Newey finally has something he rarely enjoys. Total focus. No side projects. No legacy architecture. No need to appease an established winning culture. At Aston Martin, everything is being built around the AMR26. And when Newey is given that level of control, the project stops being flexible by design. It becomes precise. Which is exactly how long-term advantages are created in modern Formula One. And this is where the mystery deepens rather than clears. Because Newey's greatest impact is rarely visible immediately. It appears in how teams behave when things go wrong. In whether a concept bends or breaks. In whether updates feel intentional or reactive. Those signals won't appear in launch photos or preseason testing. They'll emerge slowly, under pressure, when Aston Martin has to prove that this wasn't just the biggest hire in its history. But the moment it stopped being a team that hoped for success, and became one that expected it. As Newey's influence settles deeper into Aston Martin, the consequences start to extend beyond design offices and into the team's identity. This is no longer a group of departments contributing pieces to a puzzle. It's a single organism responding to one set of instincts. That matters because Formula One doesn't reward teams that merely execute well. It rewards teams that decide early what they're willing to sacrifice. And Newey has always been ruthless about sacrifice. If something doesn't serve the central concept, it doesn't survive, no matter how much work has already been invested. One of the first things rivals quietly noticed was how Aston Martin stopped chasing visible trends. No sudden copycat solutions. No reactive development spikes after rivals introduced upgrades. Instead, the car's evolution followed a logic that seemed detached from the weekly noise of the paddock. That detachment is uncomfortable for competitors, because it suggests a team operating on internal confidence rather than external comparison. Newey has always believed that once you start reacting to others, you've already lost control of your own concept. At Aston Martin, that philosophy appears to be embedded early. There's also a subtle shift in how risk is discussed internally. Before Newey, risk tended to be something to manage. Now it's something to sequence. Some risks are taken immediately, when failure is cheap and hidden. Others are deliberately postponed, when understanding is deeper and margins are clearer. This sequencing is critical under a regulation reset, because it determines which mistakes teach you something and which ones define you. Newey's teams have historically been very good at learning early and stabilizing late. That pattern is starting to reappear. What makes this particularly significant is how Newey's approach interacts with Aston Martin's new infrastructure. A state-of-the-art wind tunnel is useless if you don't trust it. A simulator is only valuable if its feedback is filtered correctly. Newey's strength isn't just in creating shapes. It's in knowing when tools are lying. That intuition reduces noise across the entire development chain. And when noise drops, decisions accelerate. That's when a team stops second-guessing itself and starts committing fully. Rivals also understand that Newey's presence changes how Aston Martin will handle failure. Setbacks won't trigger philosophical resets. They'll trigger refinement. That difference is enormous. Most teams under pressure try to reinvent. Newey-led teams tend to double down, but with more precision. They assume the core idea is sound unless proven otherwise. That stubbornness can look dangerous, but it's often what allows concepts to mature while others abandon theirs too early. There's an external consequence to this as well. Once a team behaves as though it believes in its own direction, others respond accordingly. Media narratives shift. Rival engineers start benchmarking against it rather than dismissing it. Drivers listen more closely. Suppliers take it more seriously. Newey's reputation accelerates that process. Aston Martin doesn't need to announce credibility anymore. It inherits it by association, which shortens the time it takes for the rest of the sport to treat the project as real. And this leads to the most important, unresolved question of all. What happens if Newey's vision aligns just enough to validate the approach, even without immediate success? Because if Aston Martin looks conceptually right in 2026, the transformation becomes irreversible. The team stops being evaluated on results alone and starts being evaluated on trajectory. That's when patience appears. That's when belief hardens. And that's when a team truly changes forever, not because it won races, but because it learned how to build toward them with certainty. As Newey's philosophy embeds itself further, another shift begins to surface that only experienced teams tend to notice. Aston Martin stops behaving like a team waiting for validation. There's less internal bargaining, less hedging language, fewer parallel concepts kept alive just in case. That narrowing of options is uncomfortable, but it's intentional. Newey has always believed that too many options dilute conviction. By reducing choice, you increase commitment. And once a team commits at every level, the car stops being a collection of ideas and becomes a statement. This is where the 2026 regulations amplify Newey's impact rather than limit it. With active aerodynamics, energy deployment rules, and tighter weight targets all interacting, indecision becomes fatal. You cannot optimize everything. You must choose what defines the car. Newey's career is built on identifying that defining axis early and shaping everything else around it. At Aston Martin, that axis appears to be integration. Not peak numbers. Not headline solutions. But how systems behave together under stress. Rivals are already uneasy about this, because integration is the hardest advantage to measure and the hardest to copy. You can see a wing. You can reverse engineer a floor. But you can't easily replicate a design philosophy that was locked in years earlier. That's why teams watching Aston Martin aren't asking what the car looks like. They're asking how it behaves when nothing goes to plan. Because that's where Newey's influence becomes decisive. There's also a cultural consequence that often gets underestimated. Once engineers work under someone like Newey, their reference point changes permanently. Standards rise. Tolerance drops. Shortcuts stop being acceptable. Even if Newey were to leave one day, the way the team thinks wouldn't revert easily. That's how lasting transformations happen in Formula One. Not through one championship run, but through a reset of what good enough means internally. Another layer of permanence comes from how Newey interacts with senior leadership. This isn't a designer fighting management. This is management aligning itself around a technical vision. Lawrence Stroll has effectively handed Newey authority over the most expensive and risky part of the project. That trust removes friction, but it also removes excuses. If this works, the credit is shared. If it fails, the accountability is clear. That clarity sharpens focus across the entire organization. What makes this moment so delicate is that Aston Martin doesn't need to win immediately for Newey's impact to be real. They need to look coherent. They need to look like a team whose decisions make sense in hindsight. Even setbacks can reinforce belief if they align with a long-term logic. Newey understands this better than most. He knows when to push and when to wait, when to reveal confidence and when to hide it behind caution. And this brings the story to its quiet, unresolved edge. If Adrian Newey's influence takes hold the way insiders believe it already has, Aston Martin's future won't hinge on one regulation cycle. It will hinge on whether the team has learned how to think like a front-running organization, regardless of circumstance. That kind of change doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself over time, through consistency, restraint, and an absence of panic. If those signs appear in 2026, then the transformation will already be complete. And by the time everyone else recognizes it, Aston Martin may no longer be chasing the front of Formula One. It may be quietly shaping it. As this transformation continues, something else begins to crystallize inside Aston Martin that rivals find deeply unsettling. The team no longer frames success as catching someone else. There is no reference point to Red Bull, Ferrari, or Mercedes in internal language. That absence matters. Because the moment a team stops benchmarking itself against competitors and starts benchmarking against its own concept, it stops being reactive. Newey has always believed that true advantage begins when comparison disappears. At Aston Martin, that mindset is quietly taking root. This inward focus changes how time is perceived. Short-term fluctuations lose their power. A bad weekend becomes irrelevant noise. A strong one becomes confirmation, not relief. That emotional stability is rare in teams that haven't already won together. But it's exactly what Newey's presence encourages. He doesn't chase reassurance. He assumes uncertainty and designs through it. And when that assumption spreads across an organization, panic loses its grip. Another subtle but important shift is how Aston Martin now treats compromise. In the past, compromise was survival. It allowed progress within limitations. Under Newey, compromise is strategic, not reactive. If something is compromised, it's because the core idea demanded it, not because pressure forced it. That distinction sounds minor. In practice, it defines whether a project drifts or converges. Everything Aston Martin is doing now suggests convergence. This is where rivals start to worry less about raw performance and more about durability. Not durability of components, but of belief. Teams that don't believe deeply in their concept fracture under sustained pressure. They split resources. They hedge philosophies. They chase trends late. Newey-led teams rarely do that. They either fail decisively or succeed relentlessly. There is very little in between. The 2026 regulations amplify this effect because they punish hesitation brutally. Once homologation windows close and development paths narrow, belief becomes as important as engineering. If you don't trust your foundation, you waste precious time questioning it. Aston Martin appears to have removed that doubt internally. Not because answers are obvious, but because the process for finding them is trusted. That trust is what Newey brings more than any specific design solution. There is also a long-term implication that goes beyond Aston Martin itself. If this project holds together, it changes how ambitious teams approach transformation. It suggests that identity, not just budget, can be rebuilt deliberately. That experience, when combined with timing and authority, can still outweigh scale alone. That message would ripple through the sport far beyond one team. And that possibility is part of why this project is being watched so closely. Which brings the story to its quiet but decisive tension point. Adrian Newey may never publicly claim he changed Aston Martin forever. He doesn't need to. If the team enters 2026 calm, coherent, and unshaken by early turbulence, the change will already be visible. Not in trophies. In behavior. And in Formula One, behavior is often the earliest sign that a team has crossed a threshold it may never step back from.